It's the early morning hours of April 10th, 1834, in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter. The first light of dawn is just creeping over the rooftops, and the air is warm and still. Suddenly, a sharp crackle of flames and the acrid smell of smoke shatter the quiet. Neighbors awaken to alarmed shouts. There's a fire at the Grand Corner House on Royal Street, number 1140, the home of the well-to-do Madame Delphine LaLaurie. People rush out in their night clothes, joining a growing crowd in front of the elegant three-story mansion. They form a bucket brigade, and they frantically start dousing the flames that are licking out from the downstairs kitchen. Amid the chaos, there's an expectation that any moment the residents, including the servants, will be fleeing for safety. After all, in a fire, everyone's priority is to save lives, right? But something is off. The lady of the house, Madame LaLaurie herself, appears in the doorway. In the flickering light, she is the picture of composure, elegant, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, and disturbingly calm. As neighbors race up with buckets and axes to help, Madame LaLaurie holds up a hand and blocks the entrance. "Everything is under control," she insists coolly, and her tone almost dismissive. She thanks them for their concern, but claims their help isn't needed inside. The onlookers exchange confused glances. Through the open door behind her, black smoke curls into the dawn sky. Clearly, everything is not under control, yet Madame LaLaurie refuses to let anyone in. She even clutches a ring of keys tightly in her hand, as if to emphasize that no one will pass without her permission. For a moment, people hesitate. This is one of the finest homes in New Orleans, owned by a woman known for her wealth and social standing. You wouldn't expect such a person to impede rescuers during an emergency. A neighbor calls out, asking if everyone has gotten out safely. Are the servants accounted for? Madame LaLaurie offers a tight smile and repeats that all is well. But by now, unease is rippling through the crowd. Why won't she let them inside a burning house? What could she possibly be hiding? The flames are growing, and if there are people trapped in there, every second counts. At this point, the bystanders decide to ignore Madame LaLaurie's protests, and a few men force their way through the doorway, pushing past the elegant lady of the house, despite her shrill objections. And inside, the mansion is filled with thick smoke and heat. Coughing, the rescuers shield their noses and mouths, and they spread out to search for anyone that's left inside. They call out, but no voices answer. Amid the chaos, one of the volunteers finds a staircase leading up to the attic quarters, likely where the household's enslaved servants sleep. Strangely, the door at the top of the stairs, well, it's locked tight. Why would you lock people in during a fire? A persistent dread settles over the rescuers. Something is very wrong here. They shout for the keys, but of course, Madame LaLaurie has refused to hand them over. With the fire spreading, no time to waste, a burly neighbor raises his boot and he kicks at the attic door. Once, twice, and then finally the lock splinters and the door crashes open. What awaits them in that dark, smoke-filled attic is beyond anything that they could have imagined. As they lift their lanterns, the light cuts through the gloom, and the would-be rescuers freeze in their tracks. You shouldn't be here, but I'm glad that you are, because this story is something unlike anything that I've told before. Their eyes widen in horror, even as the seasoned fire marshals, men who have seen death and danger before, reel back, nearly overcome by the sight before them. We hear gasps turning into screams. One man stumbles back down the stairs, his face ashen, and he empties his stomach on the spot. Others can only stand in shock at the grotesque scene, illuminated by flickering flames and lantern light. It's like stepping into a nightmare. What they have just uncovered in that attic is so ghastly, so unthinkable that it will permanently transform Madame LaLaurie's legacy from a respected socialite to something much more sinister. In this horrifying moment, as smoke billows and neighbors scream, one burning question hangs in the air. What horror has been hiding in this house? How did we get here? Who is Madame LaLaurie? And what led up to this dreadful morning? To understand that, we need to step back in time and look at Delphine LaLaurie's life and the world she was shaped by. Her story begins decades before the fire in an era and environment that was opulent on the surface, but built on the foundation of power, fear, and cruelty. Delphine LaLaurie was born Marie Delphine McCartney in 1787 into one of New Orleans' most prominent Creole families. Imagine the rare field where she grew up in, a society of elite French and Spanish Creole planters, where family name meant everything and wealth was on full display. The McCartneys were well connected and respected. One of her uncles had even served as mayor of New Orleans at one point. From the cradle, Delphine would have been installed with the notion that she was almost royalty in the local social hierarchy. She likely learned all of the graces expected of a lady of high status: how to host a saloon, how to dress, how to charm important guests. Privilege was the air that she breathed. But beneath the genteel manners and ballroom dances, there was a much darker reality in this world: the reality of slavery. Delphine's wealth and comfort, like that of all slaveholding families in Louisiana, was built directly on the backs of enslaved people. And with that came an ever-present climate of fear and tension. The McCartney family, despite their power, lived with the knowledge that they were vastly outnumbered by the people that they enslaved, people who had plenty of reason to hate their situation. Just a few years before Delphine's birth, in 1771, one of her own uncles was brutally murdered by his enslaved workers. You can imagine that the whispers about that incident, the cautionary tales told to young Delphine, this is what can happen if you're not strict, if you let your guard down. And that wasn't just a local incident that stoked these fears. During Delphine's childhood, news would have spread about the Haitian Revolution. This was 1791 to 1804, an event that absolutely terrified slaveholders throughout the Americas. In Haiti, enslaved people had risen up and overthrown their masters, in many cases slaughtering cruel plantation owners in the process. Haiti became the first free black republic by defeating the French colonial powers. To wealthy Creole families like the McCartneys, Haiti's example was the ultimate nightmare: an enslaved class fighting back and winning. Many white refugee planters from Haiti even fled to New Orleans, bringing with them both their own enslaved people and grisly stories of revolt. So Delphine grew up in a culture on edge, where maintaining control through any means necessary was seen as essential. Fear of another uprising ran deep, and that fear often translated into harsher treatment of slaves, all in the name of preventing a rebellion. Now overlay that with Delphine's personal life, which played out almost like a high society drama. She was a remarkably beautiful young woman. That's something that people often noted. And at just 13 years old, she entered her first marriage. As shocking as that sounds today, it wasn't really unheard of among Creole elites of that era to marry very young, especially if it was a beneficial match. Her first husband was an older man, but of significant standing. He was a high-ranking Spanish royal officer who had been appointed as a consul to the Spanish crown in Louisiana. One can imagine the grand wedding a girl of her stature would have had, and the expectations placed on her to be the perfect wife and hostess, even at such a tender age. Delphine moved with Don Ramon to Spain for a time due to his duties, and soon she became a mother. She gave birth to a daughter when she was about 15. But this chapter of her life was short-lived and tinged with tragedy. In 1804, while Delphine was accompanying Don Ramon on an official trip to Havana, he died unexpectedly. Some accounts suggest that it was from a sudden illness. So there she was, just 18 years old, suddenly a widow, and a single mother far from home. One can only guess at her emotions, grief, certainly, but also perhaps a realization that even as a widow, she held considerable wealth and status. Don Ramon's death meant that Delphine inherited some of his estate, adding to her own family's wealth. Back in New Orleans, the young widow didn't remain single for long. In 1808, around the age of 20, Delphine married her second husband, Jean Blanique, a wealthy Frenchman who was a banker. He was a lawyer, and he was a politician. He was a man that was deeply embedded in the economic and social power networks of the city. Jean was rumored to have a shadier side as well. Whispers in town hinted that he might have dabbled in piracy or the illegal slave trade to bolster his fortune. Whether or not those rumors were true, one thing is certain. Delphine and Jean Blanique were a power couple. They lived in a lavish house on a property called Villa Blanique and hosted scrumptious gatherings. During their marriage, Delphine had 4 more children. She seemed to revel in her role as society matron, playing the gracious hostess, dressing in the finest fashions, and managing her growing household. Delphine was known to be charming, polite, and adept at navigating the intricate social scenes of New Orleans. Many accounts describe her as the picture of elegance and hospitality, but even in these years, there were hints, tiny cracks in that facade, that something might be amiss beneath the surface. For instance, some later reports suggest that Delphine was unusually devoted to maintaining control over her household slaves. Now, it was not uncommon for wealthy women to personally oversee the discipline of their servants in that era, but Delphine was noted for taking a very direct hand. Still, if any rumors of cruelty swirled at that time, they were kept very quiet or brushed aside in a society that generally looked the other way, as long as one's public behavior was acceptable. Tragedy struck Delphine a second time in 1815 when Jean Blanique died, leaving her widowed yet again at age 28. This time, Delphine did not emerge merely with a small inheritance. She was left truly wealthy. Blanique's death, on top of her prior inheritance, made her one of the richer women in the city. And by all accounts, she was shrewd with her finances. She managed the estates, properties, and enslaved workers. She now controlled with a savvy eye, ensuring that her wealth continued to grow. This was a woman who understood power, how to use it, how to maintain it, and she wasn't about to let go of the lifestyle that she felt she was entitled to. For several years, Delphine was content to remain unmarried, an independent rich widow with control of her own affairs, which was somewhat uncommon for a woman of that time. However, society being what it was, eventually another suitor came calling, one that perhaps promised a mix of love, or at least companionship, and renewed respectability through marriage. And in 1825, Delphine met Dr. Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie, a physician who had recently arrived from France. He was about 16 years younger than Delphine, and she was nearing 40, and he was in his early 20s. Despite the age gap, they entered a relationship that swiftly became serious enough that in a somewhat scandalous turn, Delphine became pregnant with his child before they were wed. Their son was born out of wedlock in 1827, which certainly would have raised eyebrows among the gossiping people of the town. Delphine and Dr. LaLaurie officially married a short time later in 1828. One might think that this marriage was a fresh start, a handsome young husband, a new baby, and Delphine's other children from her previous marriage growing up amid wealth and privilege. She even commissioned the construction of a magnificent new mansion for her family. It was a home truly benefiting the now Madame LaLaurie and her status. But appearances, they can be deceiving. By most accounts, Delphine's third marriage was deeply unhappy. Dr. LaLaurie was much younger and perhaps not prepared to settle into the role of a wealthy house husband or a doting father. He was often absent, with rumors that the couple lived separately for long periods. Some say that he found Delphine's personality overbearing, and others suggest that he married her for money and then regretted it. In any case, while they presented a united front in public, when needed, behind closed doors, the relationship was strained. Through all of these life changes, however, one thing remained consistent: Delphine's place in high society. She maintained her image flawlessly. By the early 1830s, Madame Delphine LaLaurie was known in New Orleans as a woman of refinement, generosity, and charm. Guests invited to her home would note how gracious that she presided over dinners, how lovingly that she spoke to her children, and how beautifully she carried herself even as she approached her mid-40s. No one in the elite circle suspected that behind her smiles there might lurk a capacity for extraordinary cruelty. In a city that was no stranger to the cruelties of slavery, Delphine still managed to hide something far darker, something that went beyond the accepted norms of the day. So now the stage is set, but the real drama is just beginning. Now, knowing a bit about Delphine's background, her upbringing in a culture of fear and control, her marriages, her mastery of social graces, we have context for what's to come. It makes one wonder, did those early experiences in that environment plant the seeds of horror that she'd eventually commit? Or was there something innately twisted in her character from the start? As we continue, keep in mind how polished her outward life was and how normal she seemed to everyone that was around her. It's that contrast between the genteel lady and the hidden monster that makes this story so haunting. Let's move forward now to a time when Delphine and her family settled into the home that would become infamous: the mansion at 1140 Royal Street. By 1832, Madame Delphine LaLaurie and her husband, Dr. Louis LaLaurie, had moved into their new mansion at 1140 Royal Street, at the corner of Royal and Governor Nichols, then called Hospital Street. And this house was one of the finest in the city. It was 3 stories tall, with white stucco walls and elegant arched windows. On the upper floors were delicate wrought iron balconies overlooking the bustling street. The architecture was a beautiful blend of Creole elegance and American influence, reflecting Delphine's desire to display both her family's heritage and modern taste. The home was the talk of the town. People admired it as they passed by, perhaps even feeling a twinge of envy at the LaLaurie's obvious fortune. The LaLaurie Mansion at 1140 Royal Street stands silent today, its grand gray facade and ornate iron balconies giving no hint of the horrors once committed within its walls. In the early 1830s, this house was a symbol of Delphine LaLaurie's high status and cultivated life. She filled the rooms with fine furniture, imported silks, beautiful art. Chandeliers glittered in the parlors, and expensive carpets muffled the footsteps of guests as they strolled through during the lavish parties. The LaLauries kept a stable of enslaved servants, men, women, and even children, to maintain this opulence. These enslaved individuals cooked the extravagant meals, they polished the silver, they carried the LaLaurie daughters' toys, and they did whatever else was required to keep the household running like clockwork. If you attended one of Madame LaLaurie's soirees back then, you'd be greeted at the door by a servant, offered wine and delicacies, served by attentive waiters, and generally waited on hand and foot by people who would dare not meet your eye unless spoken to. In that era, that was seen as the height of luxury and refinement, having other humans attend your every whim. It's chilling to reflect on now, knowing what we do, but at the time, it was simply how the wealthy lived. Madame LaLaurie played her part as the gracious hostess to perfection. Contemporary accounts, at least from those who enjoyed her hospitality, they described her as joyful, even kind, when in social settings. She was known to lavish attention on her guests. If you were invited to one of her dinners, well, you might find an extra dessert served just because she overheard you praising it, or a little gift sent to your home the next day as a token of appreciation for your company. She especially doted on her children in public. People commented on how tender she seemed with her 2 young daughters, and how proud she was of her older children from her second marriage. In short, if you were a fellow member of the New Orleans elite, well, you saw Delphine LaLaurie as a model of Creole aristocracy, elegant, hospitable, and thoroughly respectable. However, not everyone saw only the polished facade. The LaLaurie Mansion had neighbors, and some of those neighbors, well, they began to notice that all was not as ideal as it appeared. For one thing, while the LaLaurie family looked well fed and radiant, the same could not be said for their enslaved servants. Locals noted that the slaves in the LaLaurie household, aside from a single coachman who was likely kept presentable since, he drove the carriage and he was visible in public, appeared gaunt and absolutely miserable. This was a bit out of the ordinary. Many wealthy slave owners, purely out of self-interest, kept their house servants relatively healthy-looking to avoid public criticism. The LaLaurie slaves, by contrast, were said to look haggard, with an almost haunted expression in their eyes. Then there were the strange comings and goings. It was observed that servants seemed to vanish from the LaLaurie home without any explanation. A cook or a maid might be there one week and then not seen the next. And when neighbors casually asked Delphine about one servant or another, she would give vague answers like, "Oh, I sold them," or "They just ran away." Given what was later discovered, these explanations are gut-wrenching in hindsight, but at the time, people didn't press too hard. In 1830s New Orleans, meddling in how someone managed their slaves was considered rude and intrusive unless there was obvious criminal cruelty. Still, rumors were buzzing. Some neighbors swore that they heard cries in the night coming from the property, anguished human cries that would cut off suddenly. Others reported seeing something truly unusual: Delphine's young daughters sneaking scraps of food to the slaves as if they were starving. And on one occasion, as the story goes, a neighbor witnessed Delphine chasing one of her daughters through the courtyard with a whip in her hand. The crime of the child? Trying to secretly feed one of the enslaved workers. According to the tale, Delphine was enraged that her daughter dared show any kind of kindness. That alone speaks volumes about the environment inside of that house. By this point, the whispers grew loud enough that they reached the ears of the authorities. You see, even in slave society, there were laws, albeit weak ones, about the treatment of enslaved people. In Louisiana, the Code Noir, or Black Codes, and later laws technically forbade owners from killing or excessive cruelty to their slaves. Of course, these laws were rarely enforced, but extreme cases could prompt action, especially if the owner was embarrassing the respectable class with their behavior. Delphine LaLaurie's conduct had attracted so much negative attention that an official investigation took place. A local lawyer dispatched to the LaLaurie house to remind Delphine of the laws regarding the upkeep of enslaved people and to inspect the property for any evidence of wrongdoing. Madame LaLaurie predictably put on a great show for the lawyer. She was all sweetness and concern. She reportedly even freed 2 of her slaves in a token of gesture of goodwill around that time, perhaps hoping to tamp down the criticism. When the lawyer arrived for the inspection, he found no evidence of any type of mistreatment substantial enough to act on. The slaves likely had been coached to stay silent, or they were just too terrified to speak the truth. And outwardly, besides their thin appearances, nothing horrific visible at that moment was shown. Madame LaLaurie's charm and standing did their job. The authorities were satisfied with a warning, and the incident was more or less swept under the rug for now. For a while, the gossip quieted down, and after all, no one among polite society wanted to believe that one of their own, especially a woman of Delphine's pedigree, could be truly abusive. It was just easier to dismiss the rumors as overblown. However, the uneasy feeling surrounding 1140's Royal Street never completely faded. Those who lived nearby still had their suspicions, and unfortunately, their worst fears would soon be confirmed by a tragic accident that could not be covered up. It was an event that crystallized the lurking horror of the LaLaurie house into something tangible, something that even the most genteel citizens could not ignore. Let me take you to that day, a little before the fire, when a terrible incident foreshadowed the nightmare to come. According to later accounts, one of Madame LaLaurie's young slaves was a girl, perhaps no older than 8 or 9. Some stories say that she was maybe about 12, and the exact age varies in retellings, but in any case, she was just a child. And this young girl had the duty to brush Delphine's hair each morning and make sure that it was perfectly styled. One morning, as the girl was combing through Madame LaLaurie's long hair, the brush snagged on a tangle. It was a small, innocent mistake, but it would prove fatal. Delphine, who was known to have a volcanic temper behind closed doors, flew into a rage at the girl for hurting her scalp. The child was terrified. She had seen her mistress's anger before, and she likely knew punishment would be severe. So she panicked, and desperate to escape the immediate backlash, the little girl dropped the brush, and she ran. She fled down the hall and out of sight, with Delphine reportedly grabbing a whip and chasing after her. In her blind fear, the girl found herself cornered on an upper floor balcony, or perhaps the rooftop. Accounts kind of differ on exactly how she ended up getting there, but some say it was a balcony, while others say that it was roof access. With no route of escape and her enraged mistress closing in, the girl made a heart-wrenching choice. She jumped. The child fell from a high perch of the house down into the courtyard below. Neighbors later recalled the sickening thud of a tiny body hitting the stones. The little girl died from the impact, and her life snuffed out in an instant, all because she snagged Delphine's hair while combing it. This incident could not be hidden. People had seen the commotion, and they saw the aftermath. There was no denying that Madame LaLaurie had been chasing the child, and that the child died trying to get away from her mistress. A wave of public outrage swept through the community. Even those who tolerated the everyday cruelties of slavery were appalled by what had happened. It was outright illegal, not to mention immoral, to cause the death of an enslaved person under that matter. Under pressure, local authorities took action. Madame LaLaurie was charged with illegal cruelty. As punishment, she had to pay a fine and, perhaps more meaningfully, forfeit 9 of her enslaved servants. Essentially, the law confiscated those 9 people from her, and they put them up for auction, with the stipulation that she could not buy them back. It was a slap on the wrist in terms of justice, a fine and losing some property, but it was still a consequence, and one might have hoped that it would curb Delphine's behavior. However, what happened next shows just how above the law Madame LaLaurie thought that she was. A maneuver as brazen as it was cruel, Delphine arranged for some of her relatives to buy those forfeited slaves at the public auction and then secretly sell them back to her. In other words, within weeks of the court ordering these poor individuals to be taken from that abusive household, they were right back at 1140 Royal Street, presumably facing an even worse fate now that their mistress knew that they had seen her punished on their account. This defiance of the law was basically Delphine thumbing her nose at any attempt to rein her in. It's chilling to think about. She was so determined to maintain control and continue her ways that she effectively cheated the system designed to protect those people, flimsy as it was. After the little girl's death and the subsequent sham of justice, the facade of normalcy around the LaLaurie Mansion was cracked, perhaps, but not shattered. Delphine still had her standing in society. Unbelievingly, many in her social circle continued to accept her invitations and associate with her, maybe convincing themselves that the stories were exaggerated or that Delphine had seen the error of her ways. But the locals in the neighborhood knew better. The whispers about that house turned into open talk of it being a place of dread. There was something evil there, they said. You could feel it in the air around the property, a sense of suffering that permeated the walls. Still, even with all that negativity swirling, no one could have predicted just how horrific the truth inside the LaLaurie Mansion would turn out to be. Everything came to a head on that faithful spring morning in 1834, the morning of the fire, which we've already begun to witness. Now, with the background in mind, let's return to the scene of the blaze and uncover exactly what those neighbors found in the attic of 1140 Royal Street. Be warned, the full truth of Madame LaLaurie's house of horrors is even more disturbing than the rumors have suggested. In the morning of April 10th, 1834, it started out like any other for the residents of Royal Street, until it most definitely did not. We know that a fire broke out in the LaLaurie Mansion's kitchen, but let's talk about how it started, because even the fire itself was not an accident. Down in the kitchen of that grand house, an elderly enslaved woman, the family's cook, was chained to the stove as she prepared breakfast. Yeah, you heard that correctly. She was chained to the stove. Madame LaLaurie kept her cook shackled by the ankle to the kitchen hearth to prevent her from moving too slowly, or perhaps to prevent her from escaping the house. Now, this cook, who was about 70 years old, had endured unimaginable torment in that home. She later said that she had been living in fear for her life, especially after noticing that other slaves who were taken to the upper rooms never came back. She truly believed that if she didn't do something desperate, she would be the next to disappear and die under Madame's hand. So in an act of desperation and defiance, the cook decided to start the fire herself. In an attempt at ending her own life and a cry for help all rolled into one, she hoped to end her suffering and to perhaps expose the horrors of the house to outsiders. It's gut-wrenching to consider that she saw this as her only escape. She lit the flames that she roared out of control, and as the fire spread, chaos took over the household. Smoke filled the lower floor, and servants, those who could, tried to unfasten their chains or flee. The LaLaurie family, Delphine, her husband Louis, and their 2 young daughters, they all scrambled to save their valuables and themselves, but notably, not their slaves. Now, I want you to recall from before how the neighbors responded. New Orleanians have a community spirit when it came to disasters like fires. They would all pitch in, rich or poor, to help put out the blaze, because one house on fire in the densely built French Quarter could mean many houses on fire. So people came running to help, including local firemen. As they converged on the mansion, they found Madame LaLaurie trying to drive them away from certain areas, especially that locked attic door. To the neighbors, it was immediately suspicious that the Madame seemed more concerned with controlling access to her house than actually rescuing the people inside of it. They managed to save most of the structure from burning. In fact, much of the house remained intact aside from the kitchen. But something kept tugging at them. Were all the servants out? The cook had been pulled from the fire, and she survived, despite some burns. It was she who reportedly first sobbed out a dire warning, "There are others up there in the attic." Imagine being one of those neighbors, standing in that smoke-filled hall, hearing this elderly woman hint at something truly awful above. You've heard rumors, you've maybe seen that little girl's terrible fate not long ago, and now your stomach is tightening with dread, because it sounds like those rumors are about to be confirmed in the worst possible way. A group of men run to the attic staircase, with Madame LaLaurie shrieking at them to stop. They ignore her. That door must come down now. It's bolted and locked, but with enough kicks and shoves, it finally gives way. What they see inside as the door swings open is beyond any horror story. Before I continue, I need to warn you. The scene that they discovered is extremely graphic and disturbing. This is the part of the story where the true depravity comes to light, and it's not easy to hear. If you're sensitive to descriptions of torture or suffering, you might brace yourself because, unfortunately, this is history. It happened, and it's awful. The attic room is dim, lit only by the reddish glow of the firelight creeping up from below and the lanterns the rescuers are carrying. At first, the smoke and darkness make it hard to understand what they are looking at, but then the light falls on a figure, and then another, and the rescuers realize with horror that these are people. Several enslaved people, the missing servants, are here in the attic. They are alive, but only barely, and in conditions so appalling that the men can scarcely believe their eyes. There are 7 enslaved individuals in total that they find. Now, some accounts say that there were more and some less, and the exact number gets a little bit murky through the retellings, but 7 is the commonly cited figure from contemporary reports. These people have been confined in this heat and darkness, some chained to the walls or floors, others restrained in makeshift stocks, and they are in a state of extreme starvation, mere skin and bones. One man is found shackled with an iron collar, and not a normal one, an iron collar with inward pointing spikes, so that if he moved his head even slightly, the spikes would dig into his neck and into his head. Who could invent such a cruel device? But there it is, clasped around his neck. Another victim, an older woman, is discovered with a deep, festering wound in her head. Her skull is apparently damaged to the point that her brain might even be exposed in places. She's alive, but only just. Delirious with pain, the rescuers try to help her stand, and she collapses. Her body is just too weak and broken to function. In the corner, they see a woman who cannot move from her spot because of the heavy iron chain attaching her leg to the floor. She extends a trembling arm to the rescuers, begging with her eyes more than words because she's too weak to speak loudly. When someone takes a lamp closer, the rescuers let out a cry of shock. This woman's ankle has been crushed and has been reset in an unnatural angle, almost as if to intentionally deform her. One man is chained in a posture like he's been stretched. His limbs are pulled taut, secured by chains at opposite ends of the room, like some medieval torture rack. It looks as though his arms and legs were forcefully dislocated, and he's been left in that state to languish. And then there are truly grotesque sights that defy any human comprehension. According to one widely circulated account from a newspaper, the New Orleans Bee reported on this, and other papers across the country repeated it. Unable to resist the lurid details, at least one of the men had a hole drilled into his skull, and a wooden spoon sticking out of it. Yes, a spoon, as if someone had been stirring or agitating the contents of his brain. Can you imagine the utter sadism required to do something like that? It's beyond horrific. It sounds like the work of a mad pseudoscientist, but apparently Madame LaLaurie, or perhaps her husband, who was a physician, remember, had been performing these ghastly experiments on the people that they enslaved. There's also an account of a woman whose limbs had been broken and reset in such a way that her arms and legs healed at odd angles. This poor soul was reportedly crawling on all fours because her misshapen limbs didn't allow her to walk upright. The rescuers must have felt like they had descended into hell itself, seeing all of this. They could not even immediately recognize some of these people as human beings because of this level of mutilation. The air in that attic was foul, thick with the stench of blood, urine, feces, and decay. Many of the victims bore open wounds or infected sores from prolonged restraint and torture. The floor had dark, caked stains. There were also impediments strewn about, chains, whips, a rack that looked like it was used to stretch or hold people down, and other instruments of torture that defy easy description. This was not mere harsh treatment. This was systematic, sadistic torture of the kind that even hardened lawmen and slave catchers wouldn't typically encounter. One eyewitness account from a judge, who was one of the people that were present, described the slaves as more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. Think about that. Stretched from one extremity to the other. It implies that their bodies were pulled so tight as to possibly tear joints, or even worse. Whether every detail reported was 100% accurate or somewhat even exaggerated in shock, the core truth was undeniable. Multiple people were found in that attic in terrible condition, clearly suffering from long-term abuse that goes far, far beyond even the usual brutality of slavery. This was deliberate torture, almost unimaginable in its cruelty. As the survivors in the attic realized that they were being rescued, some of them reportedly cried out, "Save us!" and they begged for water or for their pain to end. Some of them had been up there for months. One woman said that she was chained in the attic for so long that she forgot what the sun looked like. They all told similar stories. Whenever someone was taken to the attic, they simply never returned. Delphine LaLaurie had turned that space into her personal torture chamber, hidden behind locked doors in her refined home. The rescuers, upon taking this all in, were overcome with a mix of revulsion, anger, and sorrow. Some were in tears at the sight of these poor people. Imagine being the neighbors who perhaps nodded hello to Madame LaLaurie on the street, or they exchanged pleasantries at the market, and now they realized that this was happening in her house. It was almost too much for the mind to process. Outside, bystanders were processing at the gates, drawn by the commotion and whispers that something terrible had been found. One man who had gone to help was seen rushing to a window and vomiting onto the street below, unable to contain his shock at what he had witnessed. Others carefully, gently began to carry the victims out of the house. People were shouting for medics or doctors to come quickly, and the fire, which ironically had saved these people from their secret prison by drawing attention to it, was now under control. But a very different kind of tragedy was unfolding in front of everyone's eyes in broad daylight. Now let's just pause here for a moment, because I personally feel a sense of sickening horror just describing all of this. It's one thing to read about cruelty in history books in an abstract way, but it's another to confront it in such a visceral detail. These were real human beings with names and families that were somewhere, and their own stories reduced to this horrific state. It's almost unbearable to think about, and I find myself asking, what kind of person could do this? How could Delphine or anyone look into the eyes of another human and inflict this level of pain deliberately, and then go about their day as if nothing was amiss? It truly makes you question the depths of human evil. The news and the discovery spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People were shouting in the streets about what they had seen. Word reached the city authorities quickly, and a decision was made to bring the rescued enslaved people into a local municipal building, which served as the city hall at the time and would have facilities to lay them out and treat them. There, physicians and citizens alike tried to give whatever care that they could to these 7 victims. Tragically, despite their efforts, 2 of the slaves, the elderly woman with the head wound and one of the men, died shortly after the rescue. They simply had endured just too much. The others miraculously survived, at least in the short term. Whatever their lives were like afterwards, we have scant records, but one can imagine that they were scarred both physically and mentally. As the living victims were tended to, the crowd outside the LaLaurie Mansion grew larger by the minute. Shock was quickly turning into white-hot anger. The people of New Orleans had seen terrible things before, and public executions, brutal slave punishments, you name it. But this was on an entirely different level. This was a well-to-do woman, a high member of society, perpetrating acts that frankly would make her comparable to a monster. In fact, as news traveled, one newspaper would dub her a demon in the shape of a woman. And on this day, in the immediate aftermath, the public certainly saw her that way, and they were out for blood. Keep in mind, many in that mob were not anti-slavery activists or anything of the sort. Slavery was still a way of life there, but rather they were people whose sense of basic decency had been violated. Even those who accepted the cruel institution of slavery had lines that they believe shouldn't have been crossed. And Delphine had obliterated those lines. It's a disturbing paradox. The community could tolerate slaveholding, but what they couldn't tolerate was this extreme torture and sadism, because it threatened the thin justification that they told themselves, that they were civilized masters. Delphine's actions shone a light on the absolute worst potential of the system, and that made everyone uncomfortable and enraged. At this juncture, one might expect the law to step in, for the sheriff to arrest Madame LaLaurie, and for her to face trial for her heinous crimes. But what happened next is another infuriating twist in the story. Madame LaLaurie would not face formal justice that day. Let's move into the aftermath and see how the city responded and what became of Delphine LaLaurie in the immediate hours and the days after the fire. By the afternoon of April 10th, 1834, the horrifying revelations of the LaLaurie Mansion were the talk of New Orleans. Word had spread all over town about the chamber of horrors that was discovered in the attic. And while the victims were being treated at the city hall, more than 4,000 outraged citizens gathered to see evidence for the atrocity for themselves. Many went by the city hall where the survivors were to bear witness, and it's as if they had to see it to believe that this truly happened in their city. And it did. The sight of those poor souls, scarred and mutilated, lying on cots, moaning in pain, left an impression on everyone who saw them. Back on Royal Street, a crowd had also formed in front of the LaLaurie Mansion, and it started with neighbors and passerbys and kept growing as people rushed over, fueled by anger and by the thirst for justice, or rather vengeance. You have to picture this, an elegant society home surrounded by a seething mob. These people were yelling for Madame LaLaurie to come out and face them. They wanted retribution right there and then. Some shouted that she should be hanged from the lamppost, and others screamed that she deserved to be burned alive in her own house as punishment for what she'd done. The hatred for Delphine was palpable and intense, and her name was being cursed in English and French and Creole from every single corner. The term monster was on many lips. Inside the mansion, Delphine LaLaurie was in a state of panic. She knew that if she stayed, her fate was sealed. The mob would tear her apart limb from limb if they got a hold of her. Now here's something telling. Even at this moment, official law enforcement was largely absent. Perhaps the authorities thought that the mob's anger was understandable, and they didn't intervene as they might usually to protect someone of Delphine's standing. Or maybe they just couldn't control the sheer number of citizens. There are accounts that say the sheriff or local police simply did not show up to arrest her that day. It's as if everyone was content to let street justice take its course. And honestly, considering the circumstances, can we blame them entirely? The legal system had failed those victims so badly up until now. Delphine and her family had to act fast. Her husband, Louis LaLaurie, apparently had already fled or was not around. Some accounts suggest he wasn't actually in the house when the fire broke out, but others say that he was there and he escaped with her. But in either case, his presence fades quickly, and Delphine gathered her daughters, and likely with the help of a loyal coachman, the one slave that she kept healthy and presentable, she made a dramatic escape. Eyewitnesses later recounted that as dusk started to settle, the mansion's carriage gate suddenly burst open and out flew Delphine's black carriage at a full gallop. The horses were whipped into a frenzy, charging through the crowd. People had to leap out of the way to avoid being run down. The mob was caught a bit off guard. They hadn't expected her to flee so boldly. As the carriage went down Royal Street, they hurled rocks, bricks, anything that they could grab at. They shouted and even chased behind for a distance. Some managed to splatter mud or perhaps blood onto the polished wood of the coach, but they couldn't stop it. Delphine LaLaurie, peering from inside that carriage, had to witness the hateful faces of her former friends and neighbors yelling for her death. It must have been absolutely terrifying, albeit in a sense a terror of her own making. Within moments, the carriage vanished down the streets, heading towards the outskirts of town. Delphine was running for her life, and the mob was left howling in frustration. Where did she go? Well, it turns out that Madame LaLaurie had an escape plan, or she quickly improvised one. She fled across the Mississippi River first to the West Bank, and then it seems that she continued to a place called Lake Pontchartrain. There, she arranged passage on a schooner to Mobile, Alabama. From Mobile, she and her family took another ship heading to France. It all happened pretty quickly, indicating that she had the means and the presence of a mind to exploit her wealth and connections, even as the net closed in. By the time night fell on April 10th, Delphine was essentially gone from New Orleans, beyond the reach of the feverish citizens who wanted her head. So, back in New Orleans, the mob was denied the chance to personally punish the monster of Royal Street. And that's when their anger found another target, the house itself. If they couldn't hurt Delphine, they would destroy the lair where her evil had flourished. That very night, a large group of people broke into the LaLaurie Mansion. At first, maybe they were searching for any remaining victims, or perhaps any accomplices, but quickly it turned purely into an act of destructive justice. They began to ransack the place with a vengeance. Axes swung, doors were smashed off their hinges, furniture was heaved out of shattered windows. What had once been a showcase of luxury became a free-for-all. Some people tore apart the costly upholstery with knives. Others shattered the porcelain dishes and mirrors. Someone set a bed on fire, perhaps ironically, since a fire had revealed the horrors. Now fire would help cleanse the house of its grandeur. The mob stripped the walls, broke the staircases, and essentially wrecked anything that could be wrecked. By the next day, observers reported that the beautiful mansion at 1140 Royal Street was a gutted ruin. Scarcely anything remained but the walls. The elegant home had been thoroughly sacked. It stood there, charred and broken, a haunting shell of what it once was. And in a way, it was a physical manifestation of what had happened to the LaLaurie's reputation in life. Total destruction. Some might say that the house got what it deserved, but of course, buildings themselves are not evil. It was just an outward expression of collective rage. Still, it was hard not to feel a grim satisfaction imagining those fine European antiques and paintings being smashed to bits by ordinary folk who had enough of aristocrats' cruelty. In the days immediately following, the authorities finally did the bare minimum of formally investigating the remains of the house. What they found only added to the ghastly legend. In the backyard, where there had been a small courtyard and perhaps some garden space, rumors say that workers uncovered shallow graves. They found human remains, bones hidden in the soil. One particularly chilling discovery mentioned in later reports was that of the body of a child, likely the little girl who had fallen from the roof, buried in a shallow pit or a well on the property. Additionally, various skeletons or partial remains were said to be found, suggesting that those who never came back after being led to the attic might have been quietly disposed of on the grounds once they died from their torment. These claims of buried bodies were widely reported at the time, though decades later, some skeptics questioned them. Regardless, many people back then absolutely believed that Madame LaLaurie had murdered some of her captives and tried to hide the evidence by burying them in the yard. It wasn't just torture, it was killing. The newspapers had a field day with all of this. The local French language paper in New Orleans and the New Orleans Bee, which was printed in both English and in French, provided lurid details of their articles, stoking the public outrage even further. The Bee's account from April 1834 is one of the sources of those graphic details that I shared earlier, and people across the city and even across the country, as other papers picked up the story, were horrified. For a society that often looked the other way on the brutality of slavery, this was one giant mirror forcing them to see the ugliest face of it. Madame LaLaurie's name became synonymous with evil. Mothers likely quieted misbehaving children by whispering that LaLaurie would get them if they didn't behave. In the deeply religious city, some probably said that she was possessed by the devil. But notably, all of this condemnation in the court of public opinion, legally, nothing happened. She was never formally charged with murder or with anything beyond that slap on the wrist fine from before. The authorities faced with a PR nightmare, and they were likely relieved that she was gone, more or less decided to let sleeping dogs lie. It was politically simpler to just accept that Madame LaLaurie had fled into exile and to consider the matter closed, at least officially. No extradition from France was ever attempted. No warrants beyond Louisiana were pursued. It was as if they said, well, she's out of our hair. Good riddance. This lack of official justice left a bitter taste in the city's mouth. People wanted closure, but instead, Delphine had effectively escaped scot-free. Sure, she lost her home and property, but she herself remained unpunished in a legal sense. I find this part really frustrating because it's one of those moments in history where you yearn for some satisfying retribution that just never comes. It's also a reminder of how those with privilege often manage to slip away from consequences, a notion that unfortunately resonates even in our modern times. The immediate aftermath then is dual. On one hand, you have the community's powerful response, the rescue of the victims, the care for them to any extent possible, and the violent destruction of the house. It was kind of a people's justice. On the other hand, you have the fact that the chief proprietor, Delphine LaLaurie, vanished to another country beyond reach. It's morally incomprehensible, and yes, she was gone from New Orleans, but was that enough? For many, it wasn't. It felt like she just got away. Let's follow her path now and see what became of Madame LaLaurie after she left New Orleans. How did her life end, and how did she ever reckon with what she'd done? And what about New Orleans? How did the city carry on with this dark chapter lingering in its memory? Well, we're going to explore that next. After fleeing New Orleans in the face of the mob's fury, Delphine LaLaurie slipped into exile that for her may have been both a relief and a different kind of prison. We know that by the summer of 1834, just months after the fire, Delphine was in Paris. She had crossed the ocean with her 2 young daughters and possibly other family members to take refuge, likely counting on her relatives in France for support. Remember, Delphine was French Creole background, and she spoke French, and she probably had connections or even property in France to fall back on. And indeed, she apparently settled in or near Paris, living on a family estate. Now, picture Madame LaLaurie in exile. She's lost her beloved house, her social standing in New Orleans, and it's utterly destroyed, and she's infamous back home. But in France, few people would have known her crimes initially. News didn't spread internationally, but probably not everyone in her circles there would be aware. So at first, she might have been able to just pretend that she was just an elegant widow from Louisiana, living out her days quietly. There's something almost infuriating about imagining her strolling in some Parisian garden, perhaps still dressing in finery and acting as if nothing was amiss, while the memory of her victims lingered across the ocean. Interestingly, her third husband, Dr. Leonard LaLaurie, did not stick around for long. Some accounts suggest that he accompanied her to France, but if he did, he soon parted ways. Within a few years, Dr. LaLaurie left Delphine and moved to Cuba, which was a Spanish colony at that time. He essentially abandoned the marriage. It was not clear if he was directly involved in the torture. There's speculation that he might have had at least known about it, maybe even participated given his medical background, but we have no definitive evidence of his role. However, we do know that he chose to separate from the now notorious Madame LaLaurie and start anew elsewhere. Perhaps the scandal was too much for him, or maybe their marriage was always on the rocks, and this was the final straw. Either way, by the late 1830s, Delphine was effectively alone in Paris, except for some of her children. Delphine's older children from her previous marriages also ended up in Europe with her. They were adults or teenagers by the mid-1830s, and they apparently tried to manage the family affairs as a unit. It's in some of their correspondence that we get a weird glimpse into Delphine's mind during exile. There's a letter from one of her sons, Paulin Blanique, written in 1842, that is quite telling. By 1842, Delphine had been away from New Orleans for about 8 years or so, and in this letter, it basically urges his mother to abandon ever returning to Louisiana. He reminds her, almost incredulously, of what happened and how hated that she is back there. He writes something along the lines of, "Can you even consider returning? Do you not remember what happened there?" This suggests two things. One, that Delphine was expressing a desire to go back home, perhaps homesickness for New Orleans and the life that she had, and two, that she was either in denial or had convinced herself that things weren't as bad as they were, since her son felt the need to spell it out to her. In fact, her son says in this letter, and I'm just paraphrasing it, that his mother had no idea why she had to leave New Orleans in the first place. Think about that. Could she truly have no idea? It seems impossible that someone could inflict such cruelty and then just not even understand why an entire city wanted to tear her apart. So what does that tell us about Delphine? Was she delusional? Did she block out the reality of her actions so completely that she saw herself as a wronged party, a victim of gossip or hysteria? Or was she just playing innocent to manipulate her kids into taking her back? This is a psychological conundrum, because if she genuinely didn't grasp the gravity of her crimes, that points to a profoundly disturbed or narcissistic mind. If she did grasp it, but pretended not to, that's a different flavor of deviousness. In either case, it's chilling. Her children absolutely refused to allow her to return. They basically told her that stepping foot in New Orleans would mean her death, or at least immediate arrest and disgrace. Though, as we know, legally they hadn't charged her. But surely the mob would have finished the job if they ever saw her again. So Delphine stays in France. As the years passed, she largely fell into obscurity. We don't have a ton of detail about her day-to-day life there. It's likely that she lived fairly comfortably, that she did have some amount of money and possibly support from family. But one imagines that it was a kind of lonely, haunted existence. Did those screams of those she tortured ever trouble her? Ever trouble her dreams? Did she feel any guilt or remorse? We have no record of that, given how she seemed to think she'd done absolutely nothing wrong. Remorse might be too much to hope for. On December 7th, 1849, Madame LaLaurie died in Paris. She was 62 years old, and the cause of her death isn't widely recorded. Presumably, it could have been anything from a stroke to some kind of an illness. It might have been tempting to hope that it was something dramatic or fitting, but it appears that she died like any other normal person, quietly and away from the public eye. French officials recorded her death, and she was buried in a Parisian cemetery. And that was the end of the history's most cruel woman, far from the city that she terrorized with no fanfare. However, the story doesn't quite end there, because even in death, Madame LaLaurie's tale has twists. You see, about 20 years after her death, an interesting artifact was allegedly discovered back in New Orleans. A copper plate from a tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the famous old cemetery in the city. This plate was cracked and withered, and it bore an inscription with Delphine LaLaurie's name. The inscription supposedly read that she died in Paris on December 7th, 1842. Note 1842, not 1849, and that discrepancy in that year created a lot of speculation and confusion. Why was there a plate with 1842? Did that mean that her remains were brought back to New Orleans? Or did it mean that she actually faked her death in 1849 and had returned earlier under a different identity? The latter is a stretch, but you can imagine how ghost story enthusiasts ran with it. The most plausible explanation is that the plate was a kind of memorial that one of her children had placed into the family tomb. Now, if that's true, perhaps the 1842 date was an error etched by a stonemason, or maybe even a deliberate fudging to just throw off the vandals, though it seems unlikely. Historians have looked into it, and the consensus is that Delphine LaLaurie definitely died in 1849 in Paris, as per the French records. So the most likely chain of events is that she died in Paris in 1849, and then a couple of years later, her loving and apparently forgiving family brought her remains home to New Orleans to be with her ancestors, adding that flawed plate to mark her resting place. To me, there's a certain irony there. The city that drove her out might now unknowingly harbor her bones in one of its famous cemeteries, where tourists and locals walk by daily. It's almost as if she managed to return in the end, though only as a corpse. Some claim that the plate's discovery in the late 1930s was part of what revitalized interest in her legend. It certainly adds a little mystery. Did she or did she not come back? The thought of Delphine sneaking back incognito, perhaps hoping time had erased her infamy, is a compelling fiction, though it's likely untrue. Now, having recounted her ultimate fate, we are left with some profound unanswered questions and some uneasy reflections. The biggest question? Why? Why did Delphine LaLaurie do what she did? What drove a wealthy, educated, socially polished woman to commit such atrocities? Was she mentally ill? Perhaps a sadist or psychopath by modern clinical standards? Did the climate of fear in slaveholding society wrap her natural empathy, assuming that she had any to begin with? Or did she simply enjoy having absolute power over the utterly powerless and take it to horrific extremes? We'll never know her exact psychological makeup. The people of her time certainly struggled with it, and some were quick to just label her as inherently evil, a freak of nature, and that's the easy answer. She was a monster, unlike normal folks, but some scholars and thinkers see that as too simplistic, almost like it's a cop-out. After all, if she was a one-off monster, then society at large bears less blame, right? The truth, uncomfortable as it is, might be that the system of slavery allowed someone like Delphine to exist and do what she did relatively unchecked until it was too late. In a society where owning people was acceptable, where punishing them brutally was considered the owner's prerogative, where the enslaved had virtually no voice or rights, you can see how a person who had a cruel streak could push things further and further without any kind of pushback. Neighbors might ignore screams because it's not their business, or they rationalize it as discipline. The law might technically forbid torture, but unless someone basically falls off a roof or a fire happens, there's little enforcement. Delphine took advantage of that. Perhaps each act of torture made it easier for her to do the next escalating in depravity as she went. Another haunting question was, how many people did she actually kill? We know of the little girl, and we know of at least 2 of the attic victims died from their condition, but Those bones in the yard suggest possibly several more murders that went undocumented. It's entirely conceivable there were others who died under her care and were quietly disposed of, their names just lost to history. Also, what about those around her? Did anyone else in that household, her husband, her daughters, other relatives, know what was going on up there? The daughters certainly knew enough to attempt feeding the slaves in secret, which implies that they recognized severe mistreatment. But did they know about the torture chamber, though? It's hard to say. If they did, one would hope that their horror or fear kept them far away, or maybe even just trying to help in their limited capacity. As for the husband, Dr. LaLaurie, some accounts suggest that he was seldom home, and maybe that's true, or maybe that's just a convenient narrative to exonerate him. We just lack evidence. If he was involved, he certainly deserves just as much infamy, but history has kind of placed the blame squarely on Delphine, perhaps because contemporaries, especially those outraged by a woman doing this, found it a more scandalous story that a lady could be so vicious. Neighbors probably did have guilt afterwards. Imagine being the person living next door who might have thought, I should check on those screams. No, it's probably nothing. After the truth came out, how do you live with the fact that you suspected evil but you didn't stop it? There were instances where neighbors tried somewhat, like the lawyer who investigated or those who reported the little girl's death, but none of it prevented what eventually happened. That collective guilt is part of the legacy too, and that part is why the legend grew so much. People kept talking about it, processing it, perhaps as a way to atone or to make sense of their inaction. In the end, Delphine LaLaurie died without ever facing human justice. But in a sense, her punishment has been that her name is now forever linked with horror. She wanted to be remembered as a glamorous society lady, and instead, she's remembered as a murderous torturer, a figure of dread. Infamy is a sort of justice, though cold comfort to the victims. The city of New Orleans was left to grapple with what this episode meant. For many, it forced a harsh light on the reality of slavery itself. If you read some contemporary commentary, you find this uneasy defense mechanism. What she did was awful, but not all slave owners are like that. She's an outlier. It's true, not all were as depraved, but the whole system was built on dehumanization, which is a slippery slope. The LaLaurie case stripped away the polite veneer, and it made people ask, where is the line between acceptable cruelty and unacceptable cruelty? And isn't it all unacceptable when viewed with clear eyes? These were questions that ultimately the country as a whole would have to face in the coming decades. The Civil War was not far off in historical terms. For New Orleans specifically, the ghost of LaLaurie would linger, figuratively and some say literally. And that leads us into how this dark story turned legend and folklore over the years, because while Delphine herself faded into the shadows of history in France, back in Louisiana, her tale took on a life of its own, evolving and growing as generations passed. Let's explore that side of things, the haunted legacy of the LaLaurie Mansion and how truth and myth intertwined. The horrifying events at the LaLaurie Mansion were so sensational that they became an enduring part of New Orleans lore almost immediately. Even in the 19th century, people were talking about that haunted house on Rural Street, and as time went on, the story was retold again and again, each time picking up new embellishments like a snowball rolling downhill. Right after the fire and Delphine's escape, the house was in ruins and stood empty for a while. Locals would pass by and whisper about the atrocities that happened there. Imagine walking past that burned-out shell in the 1830s or 1840s, knowing the terror that had been inside. It must have sent chills down people's spines. Some said that you could hear ghostly screams or cries coming from that vacant house at night. Perhaps these were just stray cats or the creaking of damaged timber, but in the popular imagination, those sounds became the relentless spirits of the victims, crying for justice or just relief. Writers and travelers who came up to New Orleans picked up on the tale. By 1888, we see one of the earliest uses of the term haunted house for 1140 Royal Street in print by author George Washington Cable. He wrote about the haunted house in Royal Street, indicating that by the late 19th century, the place's reputation as a haunted spot was firmly established. It's important to realize that ghost stories were a form of entertainment and also a way to caution or moralize. The LaLaurie Mansion seemed to serve both purposes. It was a juicy tale of horror to thrill audiences, and also a kind of morality play, evil deeds leaving a spiritual stain. The house itself didn't remain in ruins forever. In 1838, just a few years after the incident, a new house, or a rebuilt version incorporating what remained, was constructed on the site of 1140 Royal Street. That is essentially the structure that still stands today. Over the years, this building has had many uses. At one point, it was reportedly a school. At another time, an apartment building, even a conservatory of music, and later, just a private residence. But almost every tenant who lived there, if you believe the stories, didn't stay for long and had some eerie experiences. Countless ghostly encounters have been reported. Tenants in the 19th century claimed that late at night they would hear chains dragging on the floor or disembodied moans echoing through the rooms. Some woke up to find their blankets yanked off by invisible hands. Others said that they saw apparitions of enslaved people, like a phantom reenactment of the tragedy. One common tale is that the sighting of a young girl on the roof or balcony, presumably the ghost of that child who fell to her death. Neighbors claimed to see this ghostly girl, sometimes sitting on the roof crying, sometimes plummeting and then vanishing before hitting the ground. Another tale speaks of an apparition of an older black man who would appear in chains, only to vanish if approached. If you think about it, these spiritual figures are echoes of the victims, as the legend interprets it. They are stuck in place where they suffered, and they're unable to move on. Not all ghost stories were about the victims, though. Some people believe that Delphine LaLaurie herself returned to that house after death in spirit form. Over the years, some residents claimed to feel a menacing presence that they attributed to Madame LaLaurie, as if her energy stained on the very atmosphere. One particularly dramatic account from the mid-20th century involved a couple who moved into the mansion when it was used as apartments. The husband supposedly was assaulted by something unseen. He was grabbed and even scratched by an invisible attacker. The wounds on his body, so the story goes, looked like fingernail scratches. Naturally, people said that must be Delphine's ghost, lashing out in anger. By the early 20th century, the legend had grown pretty large. In 1946, an author published a book of the LaLaurie horrors. However, her account included extremely grotesque details that had not appeared in any earlier records. She described, for example, a victim with their mouth sewn shut, and another with no limbs, things like that. These were not documented in 1834. They appear to have been later fabrications or exaggerations, but once they were in print, they became part of the lore. So if you heard about LaLaurie Mansion in, say, the 1950s or the 60s, you might hear a much more elaborated story than someone would have in 1834. It turned Delphine from just a cruel torturer into almost a Dr. Frankenstein-level sadist who performed mad scientist-style experiments. Why embellish such an already horrifying true story? Well, part of it is simply storytelling, making it even more shocking for the audience. Part of it might be the natural effect of gossip and legend over time. Details morph and amplify, and in the mid-20th century, there was a renowned interest in occult and ghostly tales in New Orleans, which was trying to capitalize on its spooky reputation for tourism. So for a sensational story like the LaLauries, It was prime material to be spiced up. However, not everyone was on board with the way that the legend was being told. There have been skeptics and revisionists who have tried to peel back the layers of the myth to get to the truth, sometimes even swinging the pendulum to the other way to just downplay what happened. In 1934, exactly 100 years after the fire, a local newspaper journalist wrote an investigative piece about the LaLaurie Mansion. The author, named Frost, had interviewed some descendants of the LaLaurie family and claimed that the tales of torture had been grossly exaggerated, possibly even fabricated by a neighbor with a grudge. According to Frost, this neighbor, whose name was given as Monsieur Montreal, lived next door to the LaLauries and supposedly had been in love with Delphine, or at least infatuated. The story goes that she spurred his advances or otherwise offended him, and after the fire, he fed wild stories to the press to ruin her name in revenge. Frost pointed out that in public, Delphine had actually seemed to treat her slaves relatively well. Again, by the twisted standards of the time. He wrote that she would personally serve her slaves gourmet food, leftovers from her table, and even give her coachman wine. Perhaps Frost mused what people called cruelty was misinterpretation or rumor ran amok. He even doubted the story of the young girl on the roof, claiming his sources told him a different version, like the child was playing and fell accidentally, not chased with a whip. It's true that any sensational story can gather exaggerations, like the spoon and the brain detail is debated, or the crab woman story could be a misreport, but to suggest that it was all just made up by a jealous neighbor, well, that seems to ignore a lot, like the fact that multiple eyewitnesses saw the victims, and the court records from before the fire proved that she was punished for cruelty, or that the mob clearly reacted to something real that they had saw. Most historians have indeed rejected Frost's exoneration of Madame LaLaurie, and they agree that while some later details were likely fictional, the core truth that she tortured and mistreated people horribly, well, it's supported by contemporary evidence. Newspaper reports, legal records, accounts from people who were there. All of these things take the conspiracy theory that might have been an attempt to cast doubt for some kind of reason. Who knows? Maybe the LaLaurie family a century later funded some kind of support for PR rehabilitation attempt. It's speculation, but families have been known to try to rescue ancestors' reputations. What's fascinating is that the LaLaurie Mansion story sits at the crossroads of fact and folklore. We have a verified historical incident, but around it has accredited layers of legend. Today, if you take a ghost tour in New Orleans, the guide will likely mix both, giving you the real facts like Delphine's background and the fire and the discovery of the tortured slaves, and some of the spicier, unverified bits like there was a slave with a hole in his head and had a spoon stirring his brains, which may or may not be true. It was reported, but it could be an exaggeration. They'll definitely talk about the ghosts, the screams in the night, etc., which, of course, cannot be proven one way or another. In pop culture, Madame LaLaurie has made appearances, perhaps the most famous being in a certain TV horror anthology series, where a heavily fictionalized Delphine, played by a famous actress, is a character. That portrayal took a lot of liberties, including making her effectively immortal for the supernatural storyline, but it certainly reintroduced her into a broad audience and cemented her status as one of New Orleans' most infamous figures. The house at 1140 Royal Street has passed through many hands. In a quirky footnote, actor Nicolas Cage bought the mansion in the late 2000s. Cage, known for his eccentric interests, he also once tried to buy the supposedly haunted Myrtle's Plantation, I think, owned the LaLaurie house for a short period. He never lived there full-time, but locals joked when he encountered financial troubles and had to sell it that the curse of the house might have contributed to his misfortune. It was probably just a coincidence, but it adds to the lore. As of today, the mansion is privately owned and not open for public tours. That doesn't stop tourists from gathering outside. Every night, you'll find tour groups on the sidewalk, the guide often holding a lantern or dressed in 19th century garb, recounting the legend with dramatic flair. People snap photos, hoping to maybe catch a paranormal orb or a spectral figure in the window. The building's current facade, a slate gray color with white trim, very stately, almost looks back at them silently, keeping its secrets. It's interesting, too, that the building itself, while old, is not exactly the same one that Delphine lived in. It's a reconstruction from 1838 after the original one was damaged. But as I mentioned, nobody cares about that detail on a ghost tour. To everyone, that's the LaLaurie Mansion. The brick and mortar might be partially new, but it's on the exact same spot, and maybe some of the original walls remain. In any case, the essence of the place is what draws people. The idea that an unassuming, beautiful home in a lovely neighborhood could harbor such darkness. That concept plays into so many ghost stories and horror tropes. The monster behind the mask, the evil hidden by beauty, and Delphine embodied that, and her house embodies it for many. Locals will sometimes say that they feel a heaviness or an eerie vibe near the house. Whether that's just the power of suggestion or something supernatural, who could say? But it's a testament to how strong this story is that even now, nearly 2 centuries later, people still sense something is there. So over time, the LaLaurie Mansion became not just a historical site, but a cultural symbol. It stands alongside places like the Tower of London or Lizzie Borden's house as locations forever linked to gruesome acts. And like those places, the stories continue to evolve. Each generation might add a new twist, a new ghost sighting, or a new theory. But at the core, it's a real event from 1834 that started it all. At this point, we should reflect on what all of that means, separating myth from reality and understanding why we continue to tell this story. What lessons do we draw from it? Why does it captivate and horrify us in equal measure? Well, let's conclude by looking at the bigger picture of the LaLaurie Mansion. Standing outside 1140 Royal Street today, it's hard to reconcile the house's elegant appearance with the horrors that took place within. And yet, that disconnect between appearances and reality is exactly what makes the LaLaurie Mansion story linger in our minds. It forces us to confront the idea that great evil can hide behind cultured smile and polished facades. It compels us to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions about human nature, morality, and our own capacity to intervene, or fail to, when we suspect something is wrong. One of the profound takeaways from the Delphine LaLaurie story is how cruelty can become normalized if society allows it. In her time, the enslavement of African Americans was legal and widely accepted among her peers. That was already a deep moral failing of that society. Within that system, Delphine's contemporaries might have comforted themselves with the notion that they were enslavers and treating people well enough while still exploiting them. Delphine shattered that illusion. She showed that once you accept the premise that some humans are mere property, it's a short path to dehumanizing them completely. Her neighbors were horrified by her extremes, but those extremes forced them to reflect on the baseline cruelty that they had tolerated all along. It's telling that many would prefer to dismiss her as simply a madwoman, an anomaly, because the alternative was to face the broader cruelty around them. For us listening to the story now in a modern context, there's a lesson too. It's easy to look back with judgment and say, I would never have allowed that to happen if I lived back then. But consider that some of the neighbors did sense something and still did little until that fire. Ask yourself, would I have done anything differently? It's a haunting question. Would I have had the courage to knock on that door when I heard a scream at midnight? or to report suspicions more aggressively to the authorities. It's comfortable to think that we'd all be heroes, but history often shows that many people stay silent or in denial until evidence slaps them in the face. This isn't to blame those neighbors. The fear and social norms were real barriers, but it is to remind us to be vigilant in our own time. If we suspect abuse or injustice or hindsight about LaLaurie's case, it might spur us to act rather than to look away. Emotionally, this story stirs up a lot of feelings: horror, disgust, sadness, anger. I find myself especially moved by the image of that little girl and the other victims, and it's heartbreaking to think of what they went through. It's important that we center them in our memories. The victims' suffering is why this matters. Their voices were silenced, but telling this story is one way to honor what they endured and to say that it was not in vain. We remember and we recognize the injustice. And then there's Delphine herself. What do we make of her? Well, it's tempting to label her a monster and then just move on, but part of me also ponders how she became who she became. Was she born with a warped empathy? Did life events harden her heart bit by bit? Not to absolve her in any kind of way, there is no excuse for what she did, but understanding the why is key to preventing such evil in the future. Perhaps it was a perfect storm, her upbringing in a brutal system, her personal privileges insulating her from consequences, and some streak of sadism in her personality that found the perfect outlet under those conditions. In a strange way, the LaLaurie Mansion is almost like a mortal tale, as much as it is a ghost story. It's a stark reminder of how power can corrupt, especially unchecked power over others' lives. It's a reminder that empathy is the choice we must consciously make, and if we lose that, then you lose your humanity. Delphine LaLaurie is often cited as one of the cruelest women in American history, and it's a title that is well earned. As for the house, does it carry the energy of those events? Well, many believe so. Even if you're a skeptic about ghosts, you might agree that places can hold a kind of aura based on what happened there. The LaLaurie Mansion's aura is heavy and somber. Visitors often describe feeling uneasy or having the hairs on their arms stand up across the street from it. Maybe that's the power of suggestion, or maybe that's something more. When I visited, I recall feeling a chill, as if the air itself knew sorrow. Now, as we wrap up, I want to recap the journey that we've all been on. We began with that harrowing scene of a fire and a terrible discovery that shocked a city. We went back in time to trace Delphine's life, seeing how a person of privilege and charm could harbor a dark secret. We witnessed the moment that her cruelty was exposed and the immediate outrage and actions of the public who literally dismantled her world overnight. We followed her into exile, saw her escape human justice, not by infamy that dodged her name thereafter. We followed her into exile, saw her escape human justice, but not the infamy that dodged her name thereafter. We sifted through how history and legend blended, turning her into a fixture of ghostly lore and cautionary tales. And now, here we are in the present, still talking about her, still chilled by what she did. That continuity from 1787 when she was born to 1834 when her deeds came to light to 2026 and beyond as people recount her story shows how lasting the impact of extreme cruelty can be. It's like a stone thrown in a pond that ripples going outward through time. The story of the LaLaurie Mansion has indeed become a part of New Orleans' identity, the city that loves to celebrate life and joy at Mardi Gras also remembers that it has harbored darkness and needs to confront it. If there's any silver lining, perhaps it's that out of this tragedy came an increased awareness in the 1830s of the need to enforce the laws that at least provided some protection, however inadequate, to the enslaved. And later, when abolition gained momentum, stories like LaLaurie's were held up as evidence of the moral depravity that slavery enabled. In that sense, exposing her crimes helped the broader cause of recognizing the humanity of the enslaved and the inhumanity of slavery. One can only hope that the spirits of those who suffered in that attic have found peace somehow. Maybe telling their story, as we've done today, is a way to honor them, to ensure that they are not forgotten amidst the sensation around the LaLaurie's name. I find myself reflecting personally on this. It's one of the darkest stories that I've ever researched, and it will stick with me for a really long time. I feel a mix of sorrow for the victims and anger at Delphine's cruelty, but also a determination to learn from it. It reinforces my belief in compassion and the importance of speaking up against wrongdoings, even if it's uncomfortable or dangerous to do so. Thank you for accompanying me through this difficult history. It's not easy to look evil in the face, even separated by time, but I think it's important. By remembering stories like this, we keep alive the conversation about what humans are capable of, both the terrible and the courageous responses to it. The LaLaurie Mansion still stands, silent for the most part. Its windows, like blank eyes, will continue to draw curiosity and dread, and as long as it does, will continue to tell the tale of Madame LaLaurie, not to glorify her, but to mourn her victims and to remind ourselves that sometimes the worst monsters are not myth at all, but real people who were allowed to do unspeakable things. Visiting that house, or even just imagining it, I can't help but feel the weight of its past. I think about the sound that must have echoed through those rooms almost 200 years ago, the laughter of wealthy guests in the parlor, and above it, perhaps a muffled cry from the attic that no one heeded. It's a chilling contrast as I finish the story, and I encourage you to carry its lessons with you. Let it remind us to be kinder, to be vigilant, and to never let such cruelty fester in the shadows. In remembering the LaLaurie Mansion, we remember that history's worst nightmares often come not from the supernatural, but from ordinary people choosing to abandon empathy. Let's choose differently. And remember, this is a place that you can visit as well. Although it's a private residence, I have to let you know that I'm a travel advisor, history nerd, and mystery chaser. I'm here to take you to the places that you didn't even know existed.